A cruel laugh echoed across a marble ballroom. Right in front of Chicago's elite, an arrogant CEO pointed at his girlfriend's face, sneering at her soft, round cheeks, calling her an embarrassment, before breaking her heart. He thought he had destroyed her. He was wrong. Watching from the shadows was the city's most feared syndicate leader. Captivated by her genuine beauty, he stepped out to claim her, setting off a chain reaction that would reduce a corporate empire to ashes. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Montgomery Hotel cast a fractured, icy glow over the ballroom. Tonight was the annual Midwest Hospitality Gala, a networking masquerade where smiles were currency and everyone was hiding a knife behind their back. For Madeline Hayes, the evening felt less like a celebration and more like a high-stakes execution. Madeline stood near a towering ice sculpture of a swan nervously tugging at the hem of her emerald-green evening gown. It was a beautiful dress, one she had saved up for months to afford, yet she felt like an imposter wrapped in silk. She didn't belong in this world of hedge fund managers, real estate tycoons, and cutthroat corporate sharks. She belonged in her small, flour-dusted kitchen at the Rustic Crumb, the artisanal bakery she had poured her heart and soul into. But she was here for Preston. Preston Fairchild, EO, of Fairchild Events, was holding court across the room. He was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a laboratory designed to produce arrogant men in tailored Italian suits. His jaw was sharp, his smile was practiced, and his ambition was entirely ruthless. Madeline had been with him for 3 years, since the days when his empire consisted of a folding table and a rented van. She had baked the pastries for his first gigs, stayed up late, balancing his amateur ledgers, and believed in him when no one else did. But as Fairchild Events grew into a multi-million-dollar corporate hospitality firm, Preston had changed. The man who used to laugh with her over burnt croissants now analyzed her appearance with the clinical detachment of a quality control inspector. "Maddie, for God's sake, stop hovering by the buffet," a sharp, exasperated voice hissed near her ear. Madeline flinched, turning to see Preston. His eyes, a pale, cold blue, darted nervously toward a group of men in dark suits standing near the VIP lounge. "I wasn't hovering, Preston," Madeline said, quietly putting down the small, delicate raspberry tart she had been admiring. "I was just looking at the catering setup. The pastry work is incredible." Preston sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as if her mere presence was inducing a migraine. "I don't care about the pastries. Do you know who is in that room? The Costello family associates. Arthur Costello himself is rumored to be here tonight. If I can land the exclusive contract to handle the Costello Enterprises charity galas. Fairchild Events goes national. I need everything to be perfect tonight. And you." He paused, his eyes raking over her. The emerald gown fit her curves beautifully, but Madeline had always been soft. She didn't have the hollowed-out cheekbones or the skeletal frame of the socialites floating around them. She had full, rosy, naturally chubby cheeks that gave her a warm, inviting appearance. Cheeks that Preston had once kissed and called beautiful. Now they seemed to offend him. "Me what?" Madeline asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You look like a Midwestern housewife who won a raffle to be here," Preston muttered, keeping his voice low, but letting the venom drip through. "I told you to wear your hair down to cover your face a bit. Your cheeks, they just make you look so round, Maddie. Like a chipmunk storing nuts. It's juvenile. How am I supposed to look like a high-powered CEO when the woman on my arm looks like she spends her weekends eating her own bakery inventory?" The words hit her like a physical blow. The air in her lungs evaporated. Madeline stared at him, her eyes wide, hoping it was a bad joke, a product of his high stress. But there was no humor in his expression, only a creeping, embarrassed disdain. Before Madeline could respond, a shrill voice interrupted them. "Preston, darling, I didn't know you brought a +1. It was Beatrice Covington, a gaunt, terrifyingly wealthy socialite whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the Loop. Beatrice looked Madeline up and down with undisguised pity. "Beatrice," Preston said, his demeanor instantly transforming into fawning charm. "Yes, this is Madeline. She was just leaving, actually." Madeline's head snapped toward him. "What, you're clearly not feeling well, Maddie." Preston said, his grip tightening painfully on her bare arm as he forced a smile for Beatrice. "And frankly, Beatrice, I agree with what you said earlier. A man's partner reflects his brand. And right now, my brand needs to project sharp, aggressive excellence." He turned back to Madeline, dropping his voice into a cruel, dismissive register. "Go home, Maddie. We're done. You don't fit into my life anymore, and I can't keep pretending that you do. I need a woman who looks like she belongs at the top, not someone I have to hide because her face is too fat for high society." He didn't even wait for a reaction. Preston released her arm, turned his back on her, and guided Beatrice toward the bar, laughing at something the gaunt woman said. Madeline stood frozen. The ambient noise of the ballroom, the clinking glasses, the jazz band, the hum of wealthy conversation muffled into a static buzz. Heat flooded her face, settling right into the very cheeks he had just mocked. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward her. They had heard. The elite of Chicago had just watched Preston Fairchild discard her like a piece of cheap, unwanted luggage. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and humiliating. Refusing to let them fall in front of these vultures, Madeline turned on her heel and fled. Madeline didn't make it to the lobby. The hotel was a labyrinth, and blindly pushing through the heavy mahogany doors, she found herself stumbling out onto a private wraparound terrace overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. The night air was freezing, carrying the sharp bite of Lake Michigan, but the cold was a welcome shock to her burning skin. Madeline gripped the stone balustrade, leaning over it, as a sob finally ripped from her throat. She cried for the 3 years she had wasted. She cried for the nights she had burned her hands on industrial ovens to help pay his early debts. But mostly she cried because a dark, insidious part of her wondered if he was right. "You are going to ruin a very expensive dress out here in the damp Miss Hayes." The voice was a deep, resonant baritone, carrying a quiet authority that commanded the very air around it. It didn't startle Madeline. Rather, it grounded her, pulling her out of her spiral of self-pity. She turned around furiously, wiping her wet cheeks. Stepping out from the shadows of the arched doorway was a man who looked like danger, tailored into a 3-piece suit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed a rugged, striking face with a sharp jawline and piercing dark eyes that seemed to absorb the city lights. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her bakery's yearly lease, and a dark wool overcoat draped effortlessly over his shoulders. This was not a hedge fund manager. This was a man who owned the boardrooms where hedge fund managers begged for their lives. I'm sorry," Madeline stammered, crossing her arms over her chest to ward off the chill. "I didn't know this terrace was occupied. I'll leave." "Stay," he commanded softly. It wasn't a request yet. It wasn't a threat. It was an absolute certainty. He walked toward her, his footsteps making no sound against the stone floor. As he stepped into the ambient light of the terrace lanterns, Madeline recognized him from the whispered rumors and the terrified newspaper editorials. Arthur Costello, head of Costello Enterprises, the legitimate face of the most deeply entrenched, ruthless syndicate in the Midwest. He was a phantom who rarely attended these events, preferring to pull the strings from the shadows. "Mr. Costello." Madeline breathed, her heart accelerating for an entirely different reason now. Arthur stopped a few feet away from her. He reached into his coat pocket, retrieved a pristine, monogrammed silk handkerchief, and held it out to her. "I saw what happened inside," Arthur said, his voice deadly calm, though a dangerous storm brewed in his dark eyes. "I abhor public displays of disrespect, especially from men who wear cheap cologne and possess the spine of a jellyfish." Madeline gave a wet, startled laugh, accepting the handkerchief and dabbing at her eyes. He thinks he's going to get your charity gala contract tonight. That's why he was so on edge. Preston Fairchild," Arthur stated, tasting the name like a bad wine. "A social climber. He builds his foundation on the backs of others and claims he laid the bricks himself. I know exactly who he is, Madeline." She looked up surprised. "You know my name. I make it my business to know the real architects behind successful men," Arthur replied, taking a step closer. The heat radiating from him was palpable in the freezing air. "I know that Fairchild Events didn't turn a profit until a certain baker completely revamped their catering logistics 2 years ago. I know your pastries are the only reason the mayor attended his last 3 functions." Madeline was stunned. This mafia boss, this untouchable billionaire, knew about her small-scale logistics work. "He said I was an embarrassment," Madeline whispered, the pain returning as the adrenaline faded. She looked down at the stone floor. "He said my face, my cheeks, they make me look like a joke, not high society." Arthur went entirely still. The temperature on the terrace seemed to drop another 10 degrees, but not because of the wind. A terrifying, lethal aura emanated from him. Slowly Arthur closed the distance between them. He raised a large, warm hand, his knuckles lightly grazing the side of her face. Madeline gasped softly at the contact, but she didn't pull away. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the brutal reputation that preceded him. "Look at me," Arthur commanded gently. Madeline raised her eyes to meet his intense, dark gaze. "High society," Arthur murmured, his thumb brushing over her soft cheek, "is a collection of plastic masks and empty souls. They carve away their humanity to fit into a mold designed by cowards." His fingers cupped her jaw, his thumb resting reverently on her cheekbone. "You have a face that radiates warmth, life, authenticity. These cheeks." He smiled, a rare, breathtaking expression that transformed his terrifying features into something profoundly magnetic. "Are the most genuinely beautiful thing I have seen in this God-forsaken city." Madeline's breath hitched. She was paralyzed, pinned by the intensity of his gaze and the sheer overwhelming power of his presence. "He is a fool who threw away a diamond because he prefers the shine of cheap glass," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "Allow me to show you how a real man treats a queen." Before Madeline could process the words, Arthur's hand slid to the nape of her neck. He leaned in and his lips captured hers. It wasn't a tentative kiss, nor was it a forceful assault. It was a claim. It was an absolute, devastating assertion of power and reverence. Arthur tasted like expensive scotch and dark rain. Madeline felt her knees weaken her hands, instinctively coming up to grip the lapels of his heavy coat to keep from falling. The kiss deepened, sweeping away the humiliation, the cold and the heartbreak, replacing them with a fiery electric heat that pooled in her stomach. When he finally pulled away, Madeline was breathless. Her lips parted, staring at the terrifying syndicate boss who had just rewired her entire universe. Arthur looked down at her, his dark eyes burning with a dangerous promise. "Go home, Madeline," Arthur said softly, tracing her lower lip with his thumb. "Rest. Tomorrow you are going to wake up to a very different world, And Mr. Fairchild is going to learn what happens when you insult something that belongs to me. The morning sun broke over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Fairchild Events' corporate headquarters. Preston Fairchild stood at the glass, sipping a macchiato, feeling utterly invincible. Dumping Madeline had been a necessary pruning. A CEO needed to shed dead weight. He was flying high. He had spent the latter half of the gala drinking with Beatrice Covington and schmoozing with men he believed were Arthur Costello's lieutenants. He hadn't met the boss himself, but he was certain the contract was in the bag. The door to his office burst open. Gregory, his vice president of operations, practically fell into the room. His tie was askew, his face a pale, sickly shade of grey, and he was clutching an iPad as if it were a live grenade. "Preston!" Gregory wheezed, slamming the door shut behind him. "We have a problem. Actually, we have all the problems." Preston frowned, setting his coffee down on his mahogany desk. "Calm down, Greg. What is it?" Did the florists strike again? "The Walton contract," Gregory said, his voice shaking. "They just pulled out, cancelled the annual retreat." Preston scoffed. "The Walton account is ironclad. We have a 5-year deal. They can't just cancel." "They paid the penalty clause," Gregory said frantically. "Paid it in full, 10 minutes ago. And it's not just them. The Sinclair wedding cancelled. The Horizon Tech launch party cancelled. 5 of our biggest accounts all sent termination emails between 8 a.m. and 8:15 a.m. Preston's stomach dropped, a cold realization pooling in his gut. That's impossible. Who orchestrated this? Are they going to a competitor? Gregory swallowed hard. "Preston, our supply chain is gone. The city zoning board just revoked the permit for our new West Loop warehouse. They said it violates a newly uncovered municipal code and our main food supplier, Gordon's Wholesale. They called to say they can no longer do business with us. Their exact words were, 'We don't want the Costello shadow falling on us.'" Preston froze. The Costello shadow. What does Arthur Costello have to do with this? Preston demanded, his voice cracking. "I talked to his people last night. We were on the verge of a partnership." Gregory looked at him with sheer terror. "Preston Costello Enterprises didn't offer us a partnership. 30 minutes ago, they issued a citywide blacklist. If any vendor, client, or contractor does business with Fairchild Events, they are permanently banned from doing business with Costello Enterprises or any of its subsidiaries. We are radioactive." Preston collapsed into his leather chair, the blood draining from his face. A blacklist from the syndicate meant total corporate annihilation. Banks would call in his loans. Landlords would find loopholes to evict him. He was ruined. But why he had done nothing to the Mafia boss. "Wait," Gregory said, looking down at the iPad, his eyes widening. "There's a press release from Costello Enterprises. They just announced their new exclusive hospitality and catering partner for all corporate and charity events." "Who?" Preston hissed. "Who did he give my crown to?" Gregory turned the iPad around. There on the screen was a professional, hastily arranged press photo. Standing in front of a massive, state-of-the-art commercial kitchen was Madeline Hayes. She looked radiant, confident, her soft, round cheeks glowing a sharp white chef's coat tailored perfectly to her frame. Standing right beside her, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist, was Arthur Costello himself. The headline read, "Costello Enterprises invests $10 million in the rustic crumb, elevating local baker Madeline Hayes to city's premier hospitality director." Preston stared at the screen, the cruelty of his own words from the night before echoing mockingly in his head. "Your cheeks, they make you look like a joke." Across town, in the newly acquired sunlit penthouse commercial space that Arthur had signed over to her that very morning, Madeline stood looking out over the city. She still couldn't quite process the last 12 hours. Arthur walked into the room, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. He handed one to her, his dark eyes warm and affectionate. "Your former landlord was remarkably easy to persuade," Arthur noted casually, taking a sip of his black coffee. "He sold me the building Fairchild Events operates out of. I've just informed Mr. Fairchild's office that his rent has been quadrupled effective immediately pending eviction." Madeline looked at him, a mix of awe and slight intimidation coursing through her. "Arthur, you didn't have to destroy him for me." Arthur reached out his thumb once again, finding the soft curve of her cheek, caressing it with a fierce devotion. "I didn't destroy him for you, Mia Cara," Arthur said softly, leaning down to press a kiss to her forehead. "I destroyed him because a rat shouldn't be allowed to breathe the same air as the woman who is going to rule this city by my side. Now tell me, what pastry are we serving at our victory dinner tonight?" The transformation of the rustic crumb from a quaint corner bakery into the city's premier hospitality and catering empire happened with the terrifying efficiency that only syndicate money could buy. Within 72 hours of the gala, Madeline found herself commanding a staff of 40 seasoned chefs, event coordinators, and florists out of a sprawling glass-walled headquarters in the West Loop. Madeline stood at the center of the massive stainless steel test kitchen, examining a tray of delicate gold-leafed dark chocolate truffles. She was exhausted, yet she had never felt more alive. The constant gnawing anxiety of trying to please Preston was gone, replaced by the thrilling pressure of building her own legacy. "The ganache needs to be slightly cooler before you enrobe them," Madeline instructed her lead pastry chef, a seasoned professional who nodded with genuine respect. "Yes, Chef Hayes," he replied immediately, adjusting the temperature on the marble slab. A heavy oak door at the far end of the kitchen clicked open. The ambient chatter of the culinary staff instantly quieted. Arthur Costello walked in. He moved with a predatory grace, wearing a tailored navy suit, devoid of a tie, his collar open, revealing the strong column of his throat. 2 massive men in dark suits flanked the doorway, standing guard. Arthur's dark eyes locked onto Madeline, and a slow, devastatingly handsome smile spread across his face. He walked past the bewildered chefs, ignoring them entirely until he reached her side. "I brought you something," Arthur murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, velvet-lined wooden box. Madeline wiped her hands on her apron, her heart doing the familiar flutter it had adopted whenever he was near. She opened the box. Inside rested glass vials filled with vibrant crimson threads. "Arthur, is this authentic La Mancha saffron?" she gasped, looking up at him. "This is incredibly rare. Where did you even get this?" "I have a friend who handles importing in Valencia," Arthur said smoothly, reaching out to brush a stray lock of flour-dusted hair behind her ear. "He owed me a favor. I told him my queen was designing the menu for the hospital charity gala this weekend, and she required the best. Though," his voice dropped to a husky whisper, his thumb resting gently on the soft apple of her cheek, "nothing in this kitchen is as sweet as you." Madeline blushed furiously, the heat radiating into the very cheeks he was caressing. "You can't say things like that in front of my staff, Mr. Costello." "I am Arthur, to you Mia Cara," he corrected gently, leaning in to place a soft, lingering kiss on her cheek. "And I want every soul in this city to know exactly who you are to me." While Madeline reigned in her new kingdom, Preston Fairchild was drowning. Across the city, in a dimly lit, sticky-floored dive bar, Preston stared at his reflection in a lukewarm glass of whiskey. His designer suit was rumpled. He hadn't slept in 3 days. Gregory, his former VP, had resigned via text message. The eviction notice from Arthur Costello's holding company was taped to the glass doors of his empty office. Preston was broke, blacklisted, and bleeding out. "You look pathetic, Fairchild." Preston jumped, spilling his drink. Sliding into the vinyl booth across from him was Harrison Caldwell. Caldwell was a notorious real estate developer and political fixer who operated in the murky grey areas of the law. More importantly, Caldwell was one of the few men in Chicago who actively despised Arthur Costello, having lost millions when Arthur muscled him out of the Southside development projects. "Caldwell," Preston rasped. "What do you want?" "I want to offer you a lifeline," Caldwell said, signaling the bartender for a bourbon. "Costello embarrassed you. He took your girl, he took your business, and he paraded it in front of the mayor. Now this weekend is the Costello Enterprises Charity Gala at the Sapphire Conservatory. It's Madeline's big debut. The entire political and financial elite of the state will be there." Preston scoffed bitterly. "I know, and I can't even get within 50 feet of the building." "You can if you're on my payroll," Caldwell replied, his eyes narrowing. "Costello is trying to legitimize his operations further through this charity event. If his new hospitality director completely botches it, if there's a massive public health scare, or a catastrophic failure that endangers the Governor Costello loses face, he loses his legitimate shields, and he looks like a fool for trusting a round-faced amateur baker." Preston's ears perked up. The sheer vindictive thrill of ruining Madeline's big night washed over him. "What do I have to do?" "I have the security schematics and 2 forged vendor badges," Caldwell said, sliding a manila envelope across the sticky table. "You know catering logistics better than anyone. Get inside. Poison the main courses with the concentrated emetics in that envelope. When half the city council is violently ill and the press catches wind, Costello's pristine gala will be a toxic crime scene. You do this, and I'll fund Fairchild Events' relocation to New York." Preston looked at the envelope. He thought of Madeline glowing and smiling next to the syndicate boss who had ruined his life. He thought of her soft, chubby cheeks that he had mocked now, plastered across society pages as the new standard of beauty. "I'm in." Preston sneered, grabbing the envelope. The Sapphire Conservatory was a breathtaking marvel of glass and steel filled with exotic flora and towering orchids. On the night of the Costello Enterprises Charity Gala, it was transformed into a glowing jewel. Strings of crystal lights hung from the glass canopy, and a 20-piece orchestra played softly on a floating stage above the indoor koi pond. In the massive state-of-the-art catering tents attached to the rear of the conservatory, Madeline was a force of nature. Wearing a stunning, custom-tailored black chef's coat with gold piping, she orchestrated the plating of 500 meals with military precision. Arthur watched her from the shadows of the tent's entrance, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of profound, terrifying devotion in his eyes. His top enforcer, a towering man named Leo, stepped up quietly beside him. "Boss," Leo muttered. "The rat is in the maze." Arthur's jaw tightened, his eyes never leaving Madeline. "Did he take the bait? Hook, line, and sinker. He bypassed the outer perimeter using the fake IDs Caldwell provided. He's making his way toward the secondary staging kitchen, where the desserts are held." "Good," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "Keep the perimeter locked. No one gets out." Meanwhile, Preston crept through the humid, dimly lit service corridors of the conservatory. He wore a borrowed catering uniform, pulling a black baseball cap low over his face. His heart hammered in his chest, fueled by a toxic cocktail of fear and pure malice. He slipped into the secondary staging kitchen. It was empty, just as Caldwell had promised. Sitting on the steel prep tables were hundreds of Madeline's signature saffron-infused raspberry tarts, the very same pastry she had been admiring when he dumped her. Preston pulled the vial of liquid emetic from his pocket. He uncapped it, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Let's see how high society likes you when they're vomiting your precious tarts into the floral arrangements, Maddie," he thought. He raised his hand to pour the chemical over the delicate pastries. Click. The blinding overhead fluorescent lights snapped on, flooding the kitchen with an agonizingly bright glare. Preston flinched, dropping the vial. It shattered on the tile floor, the chemical hissing as it hit the ground. "You always were remarkably predictable, Preston." Preston spun around, his blood turning to ice. Standing at the opposite end of the kitchen was Arthur Costello. He wasn't flanked by guards. He stood entirely alone, leaning casually against the stainless steel doorframe, his hands in the pockets of his impeccably tailored tuxedo. Yet the sheer oppressive menace radiating from him made the room feel suffocatingly small. Stepping out from behind, Arthur was Madeline. She looked completely unfazed, her posture straight, her chin held high. "Maddie," Preston choked out, stumbling backward until his spine hit the prep table. What is this?" "Did you honestly believe—" Arthur began, his voice a low, echoing rumble that vibrated in Preston's chest. "That a man like Harrison Caldwell could bypass my security. I own the company that installed the cameras in this building. I intercepted Caldwell's little plot 3 days ago. I let him give you the schematics. I let you walk right in here." Preston was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically for an exit. "You set me up. You set yourself up," Madeline said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, devoid of the anxiety that used to govern her life. "You were so desperate to see me fail, Preston, that you willingly walked into a felony." Preston looked at her, his face twisting into an ugly sneer of desperation. "Maddie, please. You know me. I'm not a criminal. He's brainwashing you. Look at yourself. You don't belong with these thugs." Arthur pushed off the doorframe, moving toward Preston with terrifying speed. Before Preston could even blink, Arthur's hand shot out, wrapping around Preston's throat and slamming him backward against the metal shelving. The sound of clattering pans echoed through the room. Preston gasped for air, his feet dangling an inch off the ground. "Do not speak to her," Arthur whispered dangerously, his dark eyes empty of all mercy. "Do not look at her. You lost the privilege of saying her name the night you insulted her." "Arthur," Madeline said softly, placing a gentle hand on Arthur's tense forearm. Arthur paused. He looked down at Madeline's hand, the lethal tension in his shoulders softening incrementally. He released his grip, letting Preston drop to the floor in a pathetic, gasping heap. Madeline stepped over the shattered glass of the vial and looked down at the man she had once loved. "You told me my face was an embarrassment," Madeline said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity in the quiet kitchen. "You told me I needed to change to fit your brand. But the truth is, Preston, your brand was built on lies, and you are hollow inside. You are entirely empty." She turned to Arthur. "I'm done with him. He's ruining the air in my kitchen." Arthur smiled, a terrifying, beautiful curve of his lips. He pulled a radio from his tuxedo pocket. "Leo, bring the police chief in. The rat is ready for collection." Preston sobbed openly as 3 uniformed officers, flanked by Leo, marched into the kitchen to haul him away for attempted mass poisoning and corporate espionage. Harrison Caldwell, Arthur casually noted to Preston as he was dragged out, was already in an FBI interrogation room for conspiracy. When the doors swung shut, leaving them alone in the quiet kitchen, Arthur turned to Madeline. He cupped her face gently with both hands, his thumbs tracing the soft, full curves of her cheeks. "You were magnificent. Arthur murmured, his eyes full of absolute adoration. I had good backing. Madeline smiled, leaning into his touch. Arthur leaned down, capturing her lips in a deep, intoxicating kiss that tasted of victory and absolute devotion. The gala is waiting, my queen. Let's go show high society who truly rules this city. The Sapphire Conservatory had witnessed many gatherings of Chicago's elite, but it had never seen a shift in power quite like the one that unfolded that evening. As the police quietly escorted a handcuffed, weeping Preston Fairchild out through the service corridors entirely unnoticed by the glittering crowd, Madeline and Arthur stepped out into the main ballroom. The transition was seamless. One moment, Madeline had been a chef in the trenches of a high-stress kitchen, and the next, she was the undisputed queen of the city's underground and legitimate empires. Arthur led her down the sweeping glass staircase. The 20-piece orchestra was playing a sweeping waltz, but the music seemed to fade as the attendees caught sight of them. Arthur Costello, a man who usually operated entirely in the shadows, a man whose mere name could cause seasoned politicians to sweat, was walking in the open. And on his arm, looking radiant, self-assured, and breathtakingly beautiful, was Madeline Hayes. She had shed her black chef's coat, revealing a stunning midnight blue silk gown beneath it. It hugged her soft curves, perfectly flowing down to the floor like liquid water. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist, allowing the warm, rosy fullness of her cheeks to be the focal point of her face. She looked vibrant. She looked real. In a room full of hollowed-out, surgically altered socialites, Madeline was a brilliant, blazing fire. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind over a wheat field. The elite recognized her. They remembered her as the quiet, embarrassing girl Preston had publicly discarded just days ago. Now she was holding the leash of the most dangerous wolf in the Midwest. "Chin up, Mia Cara," Arthur murmured, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back as they reached the ballroom floor. "Let them look. Let them see exactly who they are dealing with." "I'm not afraid of them anymore, Arthur," Madeline replied, her voice steady, a genuine smile playing on her lips. "They're just people. Hungry people." As if on cue, the waitstaff emerged from the kitchens in perfect synchronized lines, carrying silver trays bearing Madeline's creations. The saffron-infused raspberry tarts, the very pastries Preston had attempted to ruin, were served. The reaction was instantaneous. The mayor of Chicago, a man notoriously difficult to please, took one bite of the delicate pastry and literally closed his eyes in pure bliss. Across the room, hedge fund managers and real estate tycoons paused their cutthroat networking to marvel at the culinary masterpiece. The flavors were complex, warm and executed with a flawless precision that demanded absolute respect. "Magnificent," the mayor declared loudly, raising his champagne glass toward Madeline. "A true triumph. Miss Hayes Costello Enterprises has certainly found the jewel of the culinary world." Madeline nodded graciously, her heart swelling with a fierce, hard-won pride. Suddenly, a gaunt figure pushed through the crowd, desperate to get to the front. It was Beatrice Covington, the same wealthy socialite who had mocked Madeline's appearance and encouraged Preston's cruelty, was now looking at Madeline with a sickeningly sweet, entirely terrified smile. Beatrice had clearly done the math. If Madeline was with Arthur Costello, Beatrice's own vast real estate holdings were suddenly incredibly vulnerable to syndicate interference. "Madeline, darling," Beatrice gushed, her bony hands clasping together in a grotesque display of faux affection. "I am just absolutely speechless. The food is divine. You look simply exquisite. I always told Preston he was completely blind to your true potential." Madeline stopped. Arthur tensed beside her, his dark eyes snapping onto Beatrice with a predatory glare that made the socialite physically recoil. He was about to speak to ruin the woman with a single sentence, but Madeline gently squeezed his arm, signaling him to let her handle it. Madeline looked Beatrice up and down. She didn't glare. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the woman with the calm, pitying authority of someone who held all the cards. Beatrice. Madeline said, her tone polite but laced with absolute frost. "How lovely of you to attend. I hope you enjoyed the tart. It was baked with the very cheeks you found so offensive just 72 hours ago." Beatrice turned the colour of old parchment. Madeline, please, you must know, You were simply a reflection of an ugly, hollow world," Madeline interrupted smoothly, her voice carrying just enough for the surrounding elite to hear every word. "A world I no longer have any interest in appeasing. Enjoy the rest of the evening, Beatrice, and please do not approach me again. My schedule is far too full to entertain women who tear others down just to feel tall." Beatrice opened her mouth, closed it, and practically fled into the crowd, entirely humiliated. Arthur let out a low, dark chuckle, pulling Madeline flush against his side. "Remind me never to cross you in a negotiation, Miss Hayes. That was surgical. I learned from the best." Madeline beamed, looking up into his dark, affectionate eyes. "Dance with me," Arthur commanded, softly sweeping her onto the center of the floor before she could even answer. As they moved together, the rest of the room gave them a wide berth, watching in awe. Arthur pulled her close, his chin resting against her temple. "You conquered them, Madeline. They will never look down on you again." "I didn't conquer them for their approval," she whispered, her hands resting on his broad shoulders. "I did it to prove to myself that I never needed it. All I needed was someone who saw my actual worth." Arthur stopped swaying, right there in the middle of a room, holding hundreds of the most powerful people in the state. The ruthless syndicate boss lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss of absolute surrender, a public vow that she was his equal, his partner, and the sole keeper of his heart. Miles away in the damp, freezing concrete basement of the federal holding facility, Preston Fairchild was experiencing a very different kind of reality. He sat on a hard steel cot, shivering in his thin orange jumpsuit. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving nothing but sheer, paralyzing terror. Attempted mass poisoning, corporate espionage, federal conspiracy. The charges Caldwell and the FBI had slapped him with carried a minimum of 30 years. The heavy iron door of his cell block clanged open, the sound echoing ominously down the corridor. Heavy measured footsteps approached his cell. Preston scrambled to the bars, his hands gripping the cold steel. Guard. I need to make a phone call. I need a lawyer." The figure that stepped into the dim light of the corridor wasn't a guard. It was Leo Arthur Costello's top enforcer. The massive man looked at Preston with the bored, clinical disgust one might reserve for a squashed insect on the bottom of a shoe. Preston stumbled backward, falling onto the cot. How are you in here? This is a federal lockup." "Mr. Costello has friends in every building in this city." Leo rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "He sent me to deliver a message." Leo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a glossy, high-resolution photograph. He slid it through the bars. It fluttered to the concrete floor landing right at Preston's feet. Preston picked it up with trembling hands. It was a photo taken just an hour ago at the gala. It showed Madeline and Arthur on the dance floor. Madeline was laughing, looking more beautiful and radiant than Preston had ever seen her, completely wrapped in the protective, adoring embrace of the billionaire Mafia boss. "Mr. Costello wants you to keep that," Leo said flatly. "He wants you to look at it every single day for the next 30 years. He wants you to remember the woman whose cheeks you mocked. He wants you to remember that while you are rotting in an 8x10 cell eating grey slop and watching your back. She is sleeping in silk sheets, ruling an empire, and being worshipped by a man who actually knows how to treat her." Tears streamed down Preston's face, dropping onto the glossy paper. He had had her. He had had unconditional love, loyalty, and brilliance in the palm of his hand, and he had thrown it away to impress people who now pretended he didn't exist. "Oh, and one more thing," Leo added, turning to leave. "Your lawyer called. He dropped you as a client. Apparently paying him with a bounced check from a frozen account was a bad idea. Enjoy the public defender, Fairchild." Leo walked away, the heavy iron door slamming shut, plunging Preston into a suffocating, inescapable despair. He curled up on the steel cot, clutching the photo of the woman he had broken, realizing too late that he was the one who was entirely shattered. 6 months had passed since the night of the Sapphire Conservatory Gala. The bitter Chicago winter had melted into a lush, vibrant spring, mirroring the complete transformation of Madeline's life. The rustic crumb was no longer just a bakery. It was a juggernaut. Under the umbrella of Costello Enterprises, Madeline had opened 4 massive high-end pastry boutiques across the city, secured exclusive catering contracts with every major sports arena in the Midwest, and launched a line of artisanal chocolates that were back-ordered for months. Yet despite her immense wealth and newfound status as the city's premier businesswoman, Madeline remained deeply grounded. She still spent her mornings in the West Loop test kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, finding peace in the rhythm of baking. But her greatest sanctuary wasn't the kitchen. It was Arthur. The ruthless syndicate boss had completely changed his operational structure. He had aggressively liquidated his more violent, high-risk underground ventures, funneling billions into legitimate real estate tech, and of course, Madeline's hospitality empire. The Costello shadow that once brought fear now brought unparalleled economic development. And everyone in the city knew exactly who had inspired the mob boss to step into the light. It was late Friday evening. Madeline stood on the sprawling, manicured terrace of Arthur's heavily guarded, secluded estate on the cliffs overlooking Lake Michigan. The sky was bleeding brilliant shades of violet and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. The warm spring breeze played with the hem of her simple white sundress. She heard the familiar heavy footsteps behind her. 2 strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a broad, solid chest. Arthur buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. "You smell like vanilla and power," Arthur murmured, his lips pressing a soft kiss against her skin. "My 2 favorite things." Madeline leaned back against him, covering his large hands with her own. "And you smell like expensive scotch and... is that powdered sugar?" Arthur chuckled a deep, rich sound that rumbled against her spine. "I may have walked through the test kitchen looking for you and confiscated a beignet. Your head pastry chef looked terrified to stop me." "You are a menace, Mr. Costello," Madeline laughed, turning in his arms to face him. Arthur looked down at her, the playful glint in his dark eyes slowly fading into a look of such profound, intense devotion that it made Madeline's breath hitch. He reached up his large thumbs, finding their permanent home on the soft apples of her cheeks, gently stroking the warm skin. "I am a menace to anyone who stands in your way," Arthur corrected softly. "But to you I am entirely yours." He stepped back, creating a few inches of space between them. Madeline frowned, confused by the sudden distance. But then, the towering, terrifying head of the Costello syndicate did something the underworld would have deemed impossible. Arthur Costello dropped to one knee. Madeline let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Arthur reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sleek black velvet box. He flipped it open. Resting on the dark fabric was a breathtaking custom-cut emerald ring surrounded by a halo of flawless diamonds. The emerald perfectly matched the color of the dress she had worn the night he found her crying on the balcony. "Arthur," she breathed, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "My entire life," Arthur began, his deep voice thick with emotion. "I lived in the dark. I built an empire on fear control and violence. I thought that was all the world had to offer a man like me, and then I walked onto a freezing terrace and found a woman crying over a fool who couldn't see the sun when it was shining right in his face." He gently took her left hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "You brought light into a world I thought was permanently pitch black, Madeline. You took a ruthless man and gave him a reason to build instead of destroy. You are my queen. You are my partner, and your beautiful, perfect face is the only thing I want to see when I wake up for the rest of my life." Arthur looked up at her, his dark eyes shining with a rare, unshed vulnerability. "Will you marry me, Madeline? Will you let me spend the rest of my days proving to you that you are the greatest treasure this city has ever known?" Tears spilled over Madeline's cheeks, the very cheeks he cherished so deeply. She didn't hesitate. She didn't have to think. "Yes," Madeline sobbed, dropping to her knees on the stone terrace, so she was perfectly eye level with him. "Yes, Arthur. 1,000 times yes." Arthur slid the heavy, magnificent emerald onto her finger, the fit absolute perfection. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, and kissed her with a fierce, triumphant passion that tasted of tears and forever. 6 months later, the city of Chicago shut down for the wedding of the decade. It wasn't held in a stuffy hotel or a high society country club. It was held in the massive, newly restored botanical gardens that Arthur had purchased and donated to the city in Madeline's name. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the glass ceilings. The guest list was a staggering mix of political heavyweights, Hollywood elites, and the most fiercely loyal members of the Costello Syndicate, all dressed in black tie perfection. Madeline walked down the aisle looking like an absolute goddess. Her gown was a masterpiece of cascading white silk and intricate lace, but it was her face that commanded the room. She wore her hair pinned back proudly, displaying her soft, rosy cheeks, her eyes locked entirely on the terrifyingly handsome man waiting for her at the altar. Arthur stood there in a bespoke black tuxedo, looking at her as if she were the only oxygen in the room. As they exchanged their vows, binding their lives and their empires together, the city celebrated the reign of their new king and queen. Far away from the orchids, the champagne, and the adoring crowds inside the bleak grey walls of the federal penitentiary, it was recreation hour. Preston Fairchild sat hunched over a metal table in the corner of the chaotic rec room. He looked a decade older. His hair was thinning his face, drawn and hollowed out from stress and bad prison food. He flinched at every loud noise jumping as a fight broke out over a card game a few tables away. He glanced up at the small barred television mounted in the corner of the room. The local news channel was playing on mute. Preston's breath caught in his throat. On the screen was a sweeping aerial shot of the botanical gardens, followed by high-definition footage of Arthur and Madeline emerging from the venue as husband and wife. The camera zoomed in on Madeline. She was laughing, tossing her bouquet into a crowd of cheering friends, the massive emerald sparkling on her finger. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Costello Hayes Nuptials, Chicago's most powerful couple, wed in multi-million-dollar ceremony." Preston stared at the screen, his chest tight with an agonizing, suffocating regret. He looked at her radiant face. He looked at her cheeks, the soft, lovely feature he had weaponized to break her confidence. He had wanted a woman who fit the mold of high society. Instead, he had discarded the woman who ended up owning it. "Hey, fair child," a rough voice barked from behind him. A towering inmate with a scar across his jaw slammed a mop bucket down next to Preston's table. "Rec time is over. Guard says it's your turn to scrub the latrines in Block D. Get moving." Preston tore his eyes away from the television, his shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. He picked up the heavy mop, the filthy water sloshing against his cheap prison boots. As he walked toward the cell blocks, the image of Madeline's triumphant, beautiful smile burned in his mind, a permanent, torturous reminder of the empire he threw away and the queen who rose from his ashes. What a deeply satisfying end for a toxic ex who thought he could tear down a queen. Preston is scrubbing prison floors, completely forgotten, while Madeline rules the city, dripping in diamonds, and wrapped in the arms of a billionaire mafia boss who treats her like a goddess. This is the ultimate revenge story of knowing your worth and letting karma and a powerful syndicate leader take out the trash. If you absolutely loved watching Arthur destroy Preston and worship Madeline's beautiful cheeks, smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never settle for less, and hit subscribe for more thrilling, dramatic romance stories.